The 8th century brings to an end, as we mentioned in the previous video, the patristic period in the history of the church. And there are many dramatic transformations in this period. The last of the emperors of the Heraclian dynasty, Justinian II, is deposed twice. He manages to get back after his first deposition and take terrible vengeance on his enemies in Constantinople, and then he gets deposed again. His nose was cut off when he was deposed the first time, and so when he got back in, he replaced it with a golden nose. This is a strange practice which began to arise in Byzantium. They seem to think that it was more merciful to gouge people's eyes out or mutilate them rather than kill them when they defeated their political enemies, which I suppose it is, but it seems rather gruesome. Gouging eyes out was particularly popular because Roman law didn't allow a blind person to hold office. There was a civil war after the second deposition of Justinian II. It should be noted that during his second reign, Constantinople was visited by Pope Constantine. There was only ever one Pope Constantine, and this was the last time for a very, very long time that any pope would visit Constantinople. And Justinian II prostrated himself in front of the Pope on that occasion, despite having been rather heavy-handed with the papacy after the Council of Trullo. In the civil war that followed his second deposition, eventually a soldier from Asia Minor, Leo III, managed to seize power in Constantinople, but by the time he did so, Constantinople was under siege from the Arabs. There had been an earlier Arab siege of Constantinople back in the 7th century, but historians at the moment are somewhat divided as to whether this actually happened. It sounds strange that such a large event should be contested in this way, but this period is known as the Byzantine Dark Ages because the empire suffered such terrible reverses and such damage that the documentary record is extremely thin, so actually it is quite hard to tell what's going on. The darkest part of the Western Dark Ages, especially for the British Isles, came in the 5th and 6th centuries, when we only have 3 or 4 documents that really survive from the British Isles at all for that period. That, of course, is when the legends about King Arthur are set, and that's partly because in the vacuum of history, whatever the fragmentary reports of events may be, are transformed into legend. So whether this was the first or the second siege of Constantinople, the city was subjected to siege and could have fallen in 717 to 718. And its capture was averted by a stalwart defence by Leo III, but also by a technological innovation, which also, its origin is contested. It may date to this first siege in the previous century, which, of course, it can't have done if that siege never happened, but certainly it was the means by which the capital was delivered from the Arab fleet in the siege of 717, and this is called Greek fire. And we still don't know what the actual recipe for Greek fire is. It was a kind of napalm, a sort of adhesive jelly, which burned very intensely and was not extinguished underwater. Byzantine galleys would fire this flaming jelly through a kind of funnel device, and it would adhere to the Arab ships, which would then founder and sink in the water with their screaming inhabitants trying to throw themselves beyond the flaming substance on the waves. So that's very handy if you're facing extinction at the hands of a hostile, super powerful geopolitical enemy. So thanks to Greek fire, and no doubt the prayers of its inhabitants, the city of Constantinople survived this siege. But naturally, especially as the Romans were peculiarly obsessed with the concept of victory. Obviously, people are generally rather keen on victory, and many cultures have been preoccupied with it, and their society is structured to facilitate victory over their enemies, obviously. But the Romans, the very title emperor means commander-in-chief, and the Romans peculiarly tied the legitimacy of their ruler to the fact that he was favoured by God in battle. So having lost more than half of your territory in slightly less than a century is obviously going to, provoke reflection on the part of a Roman ruler. And unfortunately, these reverses, combined with the eruption of the volcano of Thera and the islands that are now known as Santorini, which caused flaming ash to descend on the capital. This reflection on the Roman reverses led the Emperor Leo III to the conclusion that God was punishing the empire for using images in worship and in its churches. This is a strange development. It seems that the reason this happened is that the use of images had significantly increased over the course of the previous 2 centuries. They are alluded to in the canons of the Council in Trullo in the previous century, and the emperors had started to place the image of Christ on the obverse of the coinage with the emperor on the back. So they'd become much more prominent in the empire over recent centuries. Earlier on in the history of the church, we know that images were used in the sacred space of the Christian liturgy because we have archaeological remains in the catacombs and in the house church of Dura Europas and various other places that date to long before Constantine, which show that images had been used by Christians all the way back to the beginning of the church. St. Paul, in an enigmatic passage in the letter to the Galatians, talks about the Galatians before whom Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified. We don't really know what that means, but it's suggestive anyway. So we know that images were used. However, we also know in the 4th century that when things began to loosen up, because the end of the persecution, the conversion of Constantine, that there was some reticence about any growing use of images. There's a letter of contested authenticity attributed to the historian Eusebius of Caesarea, in which he reacts negatively to an imperial princess wanting an image of Christ. There's another father later in the century who removed a curtain with images on it from a church and suggested that it should be used as a winding sheet for a Christian burial. It's interesting in these cases that despite the resistance of the authors to the use of the images, they don't want the destruction of them as if they were idols. They want them to be put somewhere where they will not be dishonoured, but they want them removed from public view. So it's not precisely clear what's going on. And especially as all our known places of Christian worship, or many of our known places of Christian worship from before the time of Constantine, contain images, it's hard to believe that the use of images in the worship space was a complete novelty, or would have itself seemed shocking. In fact, Eusebius of Caesarea, in his History of the Church, talks about the woman with the hemorrhage in the Gospels who touched the hem of Christ's garment and was healed, having built a statue of herself and Christ in Tiberias, an image of her kneeling behind Christ and touching the hem of his garment and him turning around and seeing her. And Eusebius doesn't express any concern about this when he describes this. So one can only suppose that what they were concerned about was that these objects would would be the direct objects of exterior reverence. Now, if they considered that heretical, that would be a problem for Catholic doctrine, because we definitely don't think that's the case. It's infallibly defined that there isn't a problem with that. But of course, there could be a problem if there were a danger that this reverence would not be reverence, but would actually be worship, as if there was some sort of idea of a kind of real presence of the saint or the divine person in question in the object being reverenced, not like picking up a photograph of your wife and family off your desk in your office and kissing it out of affection for them, but sort of kneeling down in front of it and prostrating yourself, which would be an odd thing to do, because one shouldn't really worship one's wife and family, however marvellous they may be. The most plausible explanation, given all the context for these episodes in the 4th century, is that it's not the images or even reverence given to the original through the image which is objected to, but it is feared that in a society that's only just converted from pagan idolatry, that these will be seen as and treated as idols to be actually worshipped in the same way as the pagans gave worship to a deity they believed to be dwelling within the statues in their temples. Anyway, this concern declined over the decades and centuries as there were fewer and fewer pagans left in the Roman Empire or in the barbarian West. And so the number of images used in churches and the degree of exterior reference given to those images began to proliferate. And so it's quite understandable that Leo III, if he was aware of this change in the frequency of the use of images, might decide that at some point in the past there might have been no images in churches, which, as I say, we know isn't true. And so he reacted by deciding that because, of course, the Muslims famously do not use any images at all, except of vegetables or mathematical patterns, nothing, no locomotive animals or human beings or angels are allowed to be depicted in Islamic art. So it's quite natural that Leo III might have thought that the Muslims were being used as a scourge to punish the Christians for their veneration of images. And so he began an attack on the veneration of images. According to the surviving accounts, this began in 726 when the image of Christ above one of the gates of the imperial palace was taken down, and it's said that this triggered a riot. There was then the Patriarch of Constantinople, St. Germanus of Constantinople, refused to cooperate with this campaign. He was simply passively disobedient initially, but eventually he was forced into abdication. The Pope, Gregory II, refused to cooperate. Relations were already bad with the Pope because the Emperor had been trying to seize some papal territories in southern Italy to enrich the imperial administration, papal lands. The popes didn't actually govern directly at that point, although they were the de facto rulers of Rome already. As with Justinian II, the emperor in Constantinople attempted to use heavy-handed methods to enforce his will on the pope, and as with Justinian II, he found this was not possible because the population of Italy, the Roman population of Italy, were unwilling to cooperate with any kind of attack on the Pope. And so the iconoclastic crisis led to the final dissolution of imperial control over Italy. Eventually, as we mentioned in the previous century, in 750, the last northern Italian provinces, territories ruled from Ravenna were lost. Ravenna itself was conquered. Rome fell out of the control of the emperor in Constantinople. This led to a dramatic transformation in the West. The West had also been undergoing serious challenges from Islam. In the opening decade of the century, the whole of Spain was conquered in really only about 10 years. A small region in the northwest of Spain called the Asturias held out and was still sort of held onto by a kind of Christian guerrilla leader called Pelago, the Prince of the Asturias. And because of his heroic resistance and the fact that not all Spain was ever completely controlled by Islam, The heir to the Spanish throne to this day holds the title Prince of the Asturias, or currently Princess of the Asturias. The Muslims moved beyond the Pyrenees and into southern France, and eventually got all the way up as far as the Loire River, which runs halfway through France. And it looked as if they might even capture the city of Tours, which would have been particularly catastrophic because the patron of the Franks was Saint Martin of Tours, one of the first pioneers of Western monasticism, greatly honoured and loved in the West, and particularly in Gaul and later France. Unfortunately, the descendants of Clovis, the first Catholic, first Christian king of the Franks, were not particularly impressive militarily. It's said that they were only allowed to marry relatives, fellow members of the Merovingian dynasty, and that as a result, their mental faculties had begun to decline. Whether this is true or not, I don't know. They're also famously not allowed to cut their hair. There was a surviving pagan superstition that somehow sacred power was contained in the hair of the Merovingian kings, and so they sort of sat there like heavy metal stars who'd taken too many drugs in their 20s, not altogether able to run things, and with very long hair. One of the consequences of this was that a hereditary dynasty of prime ministers called the mayors of the palace had developed, and this family were basically running the Frankish dominions, which were very extensive by this point and covered most of Christian, non-Muslim conquered Western Europe. The Frankish kingdom was largely run by these mayors of the palace. At the time that the Muslims reached the Loire, the mayor of the palace was a man called Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, and he managed to lead a heroic counterattack at the Battle of Tours-Poitiers. It seems to have taken place equidistant between those two cities. And he drove back the Muslims eventually beyond the Pyrenees, and this great victory in 732, so exactly 100 years after the death of Muhammad, which began the rollback of Islam into the West, also together with the resistance of Pelago, became the beginning of the Reconquista, the 7-century-long war by the Spanish to reconquer their country from Islamic invasion. As previously mentioned, Charles Martel was offered, in recognition of this great victory, the title of Roman consul from the Pope, but he turned it down. Another transformation that Charles Martel effected, and which reflects the quite fraught relations actually between him and the episcopal hierarchy, is that he began to ensure that all the bishops in the former Roman province of Gaul, including in the south, were Franks, whereas up to this point the old Gallo-Roman aristocracy had managed to retain control over the diocese in the south of the country and preserve the culture of Roman Gaul and of the Western Roman Empire. His imposition of often rather inappropriate and too young Frankish and sometimes illiterate, often illiterate, Frankish candidates for these sees basically killed off the continuous culture which had clung on by its fingernails from ancient Gaul all the way through into the 8th century. When Charles Martel died, he was succeeded as mayor of the palace by his son Pepin, known as Pepin the Short. And Pepin took advantage, of the difficult situation of the papacy, because, as mentioned, in 750, Rome had fallen, had ceased to be controllable by the Byzantines, and the Lombards had seized control of Ravenna. The popes did not wish to end up being ruled by the Lombards. Although they had recently finally converted to Catholicism and abandoned Arianism, they were nevertheless not considered as desirable temporal overlords by the popes. Pepin therefore wrote to the Pope and said, Pope Zachary, as he was at this time, and said that he was troubled in conscience because he felt that it was inappropriate for him to be the ruler of the Frankish kingdom, and yet for there to be another person who had the title king, rex, which simply means ruler, who didn't actually exercise the authority. And it seemed perhaps that really either the person with the title king should exercise real authority, or the person who was exercising real authority should have the title king. And what did the Pope think about this? And by the way, he'd heard he'd had some difficulties with the Lombards and was thinking of spending a little bit of time in central Italy with a large army in the next few years, and would that be helpful for the Holy Father? So Pope Zachary replied and said that, yes, it did seem rather inappropriate, and that perhaps really either the person with the de facto power should have the title king, or the person with the title king should have the de facto power. And yes, it would be extremely helpful if he brought a large army down to central Italy and delivered him from the Lombards. So the arrangement which took place is that Childeric III, the last Merovingian king, had his hair shaved off, lost his magic powers, whatever they were, and was sent off into a monastery, retired as king, and Pepin was anointed, according to some accounts, by the great Anglo-Saxon missionary Boniface, who had been converting the Germans to Christianity in the meantime, as king of the Franks. And his dynasty, which would become known as the Carolingian dynasty, succeeded to the Merovingian dynasty. And Pepin rewarded the Pope for his theological views on this question by going down into Italy, chasing away the Lombards, and endowing the Pope with the old Byzantine Duchy of Rome, the territory immediately around Rome, which from that point onwards the popes ruled as their own territory. And this is the beginning of the history of what is known as the Papal State, which continues all the way on until the year 1870, and then was extinguished by Italian liberal nationalists until the Vatican City State was created by the Lateran Treaties in 1929, which, of course, the Vatican City State still exists to this day. So from the beginning, there was a very close relationship between this new Carolingian dynasty and the popes. And in fact, the Pope himself, Pope Stephen, would then go north and personally anoint both Pepin and his two sons, Charles and Charlemagne, sealing the relationship between the Carolingians and the papacy even more. In fact, the practice of anointing kings was a novel one at this time. It hadn't previously existed, certainly not in the West, not in mainland Western Europe. So this dynasty owed a great deal to the popes. On the death of Pepin, he was succeeded jointly by his two sons, Charles and Charlemagne, but Charlemagne himself died not long thereafter, leaving Charles as the undisputed king of the Frankish kingdom. Charles was a very able ruler, and he would carry on ruling all the way down to 814, and he conquered the Duchy of Bavaria. Duke Tassilo of Bavaria was defeated and his duchy taken from him, and he conquered the kingdom of the Lombards. The Lombards had been chased away from Rome, but they had been left with their original territories. But Charles took them away and declared himself king of the Lombards. He also campaigned in the north of Spain and extended the Christian territories along the northern coast of Spain as far as the shrine of St. James in Santiago de Compostela, which first appears into recorded history at this time. The collapse of the Western Empire and then the colonization by Frankish aristocrats of the southern Gaulish episcopacy under Charles Martel had caused a very serious decline in literacy and learning in the West, and Charles was determined to reverse this, and he encountered an Anglo-Saxon scholar, a deacon by the name of Alcuin of York. Alcuin was a pupil of the Venerable Bede, and the library in York had replicated the contents of the library at the monastery of Monk Wearmouth Jarrow, and therefore Alcuin was one of the most erudite men in the whole of Western Christendom. Eventually, Charlemagne as he became known, Charles the Great, Carolus Magnus, became known as Charlemagne because of his achievements. He persuaded Alcuin to move to Western Europe, away from England, and he put him in charge of restoring learning in the West. Alcuin and the monks who ended up subject to him, because he eventually became abbot of Tours, but initially he lived in Aachen, the capital of the Frankish kingdom. Alcuin developed a new way of writing which involved lowercase letters, which had previously not existed in Latin, and also developed punctuation for the Latin language. And this form of writing is known as Carolingian minuscule, and it became much easier to read and much easier to write quickly. And so, in fact, there are many texts of Latin antiquity which we only possess now because they were copied by Alcuin and his monks during this period. Alcuin also put a great deal of effort into perfecting and correcting the text of St. Jerome's Vulgate. St. Jerome, great father of the 4th century, he had been asked by Pope Damasus in the 4th century to translate the scriptures from their original languages into Latin in order to correct and replace what's known as the Vetus Latina, the somewhat amateurish Latin translation of scripture, which Latin Christians have been relying on up to that point. So Alcuin perfected and restored the Vulgate. Charlemagne had a number of difficulties with the Saxons in the German parts of his dominions, who were reluctant to convert to Christianity and were constantly rebelling against him. Eventually, Charlemagne resolved to coercively convert them to Christianity. This is forbidden, and he was told off for doing it by Alcuin. But it is one of the rare instances in which it's clear that violent conversion occurred in the expansion of Christianity in Western Europe. The iconoclastic crisis came to a provisional end in Byzantium during Charlemagne's reign. The last of the iconoclastic emperors died unexpectedly early, and his consort, his wife Irene of Athens, became regent for their infant son, Constantine VI. Irene of Athens had in fact secretly remained an iconodule, and she convened an ecumenical council, the Seventh Ecumenical Council, the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, and this condemned iconoclasm and canonized the Church's teaching on the subject of icons. However, later on in his reign, after he took personal control of the government, Constantine VI fell out quite badly with his mother, and she was packed off to a convent, and he took complete control of the government, which he then didn't run very well, and he was seen, because he was unpopular with those who admired his mother, who had restored the images. He was seen to be drifting towards the remaining clandestine iconoclasts. Taking advantage of the consternation about this, Irene escaped from her confinement and deposed her son and attempted to have his eyes gouged out, in fact, unedifyingly, in the very room where she'd given birth to him. This was in the year 797. This seems to have gone badly wrong, as far as such a violent act can go well, Constantine VI bled out and died. This put Irene in a difficult situation because, according to Roman law, a woman cannot hold office in the Roman Republic. So she declared herself emperor nonetheless, and in fact occasionally used the title emperor instead of empress, as if changing the gender of the word would somehow solve the legal problem. But this was not accepted in the West, and it was the last straw for the acceptance by the Franks, who now ruled greater dominions in extent than the emperor in Constantinople. It was the last straw for their acceptance that the emperor in Constantinople was truly the leader of the Christian world, the temporal leader of the Christian world. At the same time, a dispute arose about the new Pope, Pope Leo III. The previous Pope, Pope Adrian, had come from one of the great Roman noble families who were increasingly dominating the papacy now that he's actually ruled central Italy. Leo III didn't. He was from a more plebeian origin, and he was resented by the local aristocracy, and particularly by the family of his predecessor. And in 799, while he was leading one of the papal processions to the stational churches, he was assaulted in the streets by partisans of his predecessor's family, his eyes and tongue removed, and he was taken off they intended perpetual imprisonment in a nearby fortress. However, according to the contemporary accounts, his eyes and tongue were miraculously restored. He is, after all, Saint Leo III, and he escaped, probably because they thought he couldn't see when he really could. And he got to Charlemagne back in the northern part of his kingdom, in his capital, and laid his case before him. Charlemagne was then presented with a very serious crisis because it was generally held that in some way Rome holds back the coming of the Antichrist. This is based on the teaching of St. Paul and the way in the second letter to the Thessalonians and how it was interpreted by the fathers. And it was also held on the basis of the Greek translation of Scripture, which some Latin chronologies were based on, even though in general it was the Latin text from the Hebrew that was being used. But these chronologies, if you followed them, would indicate that the year 800 AD would be the 6,000th year after the creation of the world. And there was an ancient Christian legend that the Antichrist would emerge in that year. And so there was great panic because there was no true emperor in Constantinople and no true pope in Rome. So the two Roman powers were apparently overthrown. And so Charlemagne hastened to Rome to try and reverse this situation. He captured and imprisoned and then, at the request of Leo III, exiled rather than executed Leo's enemies who had deposed him. He restored Leo to the papal throne. Leo swore an oath that he was not guilty of any of the charges laid against him. He couldn't be judged by any earthly power because he's the highest judge on earth as the Pope. And then a few days later, on Christmas Day 800 AD, Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III in St. Peter's Basilica. It's a very shocking act which dramatically altered the course of Christian and Western history. So there was now once again a pope and an emperor, but the title emperor had been by papal act apparently confiscated from Constantinople and given to the king of the Franks, with dramatic consequences for subsequent history, which we will explore in our later videos.